These have definitely been a busy couple of weeks, and there were a lot of COVID-related news, some good, some not so good. So I thought I'd start today by giving you what I could find about the vaccines. So of course, last week we learned of a Pfizer and BioNTech. So this is a joint vaccine. Pfizer, of course, is a giant pharmaceutical company, and BioNTech is a small, well, relatively small, I guess. It's traded on NASDAQ, I believe, a German company that had released their preliminary study or interim analysis on a phase 3 study. The study itself is a very long document. There's about 160 pages. It's available from Pfizer, and this is its title page. So this is an mRNA vaccine. It's one of the, if you go back to when we discussed vaccines, there are several different vectors and delivery mechanisms. So mRNA vaccine is basically just engineered molecule that gets delivered directly in an liquid nanoparticle to the cell. So it's supposed to basically just deliver the antigen as opposed to more traditional vaccines that are attenuated or inactivated or recombinant. So this is an entirely new vaccine technology, new in the sense that there hasn't been an FDA approved or public or widely distributed vaccine using this technique. It has a lot of advantages, a lot of unknowns. BioNTech has developed RNA-based vaccine candidates using a platform approach that enables the rapid development of vaccines against emerging viral diseases. Each vaccine candidate is based on a platform of nucleoside modified messenger RNA. This is the internal name, BNT162A or B, B1 and B2. Each vaccine candidate expresses one of two antigens, either the full-length pre-fusion spike protein P2S, version 9, so there's an actual record of what this is, or a trimerized SARS-CoV-2 spike glycoprotein receptor binding domain. So, the version 2 has a longer antigen. And all candidates are formulated in the same lipid nanoparticle composition. So if you dig into the clinical trial description into the protocol, like I said, I haven't read it all because it's 160 pages. But the important thing is, if you remember, there are a number of things to identify as primary endpoints. So this was what we read about in the news was for phase 3 interim analysis. So the objective was, this is the top row of the table, to evaluate the efficacy of a prophylactic BNT162b2 against confirmed COVID-19 occurring from 7 days after the second dose in participants without evidence of infection before vaccination. And the primary efficacy is participants complying with the key protocol criteria at least 7 days after receipt of the second dose of study intervention. Right, so this is the 1 minus efficacy, right? So this is what they measure. This is pretty much just traditional definition of vaccine efficacy. So this is a large study. So if you remember, phase 1 is small, phase 2 is larger, and phase 3 is a much larger study. So, they look, and it's important to sort of understand what it is that they're testing. So this is phase 2/3, a dose of 30 micrograms will comprise, 21,999 vaccine recipients. They'll be divided into different strata. So this is basically a teenager stratum, 2,000 participants. It is intended for a minimum 40% of participants to be in the greater than 55-year stratum. And an equal number of participants will receive placebo. So the same number will receive placebo. And what the study evaluates, it's a prime boost design. So you have 2 doses separated by 21 days. And what that means is that the vaccine is not considered effective until, or it's not considered to be enforced until you've received 2 doses. and waited some time after the second dose. And they're different, they'll have different schedules potentially for different age groups, and they tried different volumes of vaccine. And for vaccine candidates selected for phase 2-3 evaluation, this VNT162b2 had a dose of 30 milligrams. There is actually very little hard data about this vaccine. I tried to find it, maybe I just wasn't successful. So this is the press release for Pfizer, which was made earlier this week. And let's just sort of read it at face value. Vaccine candidate was found to be more than 90% effective in preventing COVID-19 in participants without evidence of prior SARS-CoV-2 infection in the first interim efficacy analysis. Right, so just to parse it a little bit, this trial is still ongoing, so it hasn't completed. There hasn't been a full report made or anything like it. An interim analysis is just that. It means that as the trial is ongoing, there are specific checkpoints built into the protocol. There's a data analysis group that's empaneled, at the outset of the trial, and their job is to perform these scheduled interim analyses, and if the findings warrant it, to disseminate the information. So that's all it is. It's not a completely trial. It's just an interim efficacy analysis. Analysis evaluated 94 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in trial participants. The study enrolled nearly 43,500 participants. So here's one thing you might notice, that it's a very, very small number of confirmed cases. So out of 43,500 participants, fewer than 100 received what were confirmed to have acquired COVID-19. There's not a whole lot of information about who they've enrolled. So there's diverse backgrounds and no serious safety concerns, but just have to take them at face value. So submission for emergency use authorization to the FDA is planned for soon after the required safety milestone is achieved, which is currently expected to occur in the third week of November. And then clinical trial is to continue through to a final analysis of 164 confirmed cases in order to collect further data and characterize the vaccine candidate's performance against other study endpoints. So this 164, you might ask what it is. It's something that was calculated beforehand using statistical techniques to say, once we've reached this many cases, we should have enough power to determine whether or not the vaccine is efficacious. So here's another quote from the press release. After discussions with the FDA, the companies recently elected to drop the 32 case interim analysis and conduct the first interim analysis at a minimum of 62 cases. But at conclusion of those discussions, the valuable case count reached 94, and the DMC, which is data something monitoring, I forget what the abbreviation stands for, performed in the first analysis of all the cases. The case split between vaccinated individuals and those who received the placebo indicates a vaccine efficacy rate above 90% at 7 days after the second dose. This means the protection is achieved 28 days after the initiation of the vaccination, which consists of a 2-dose schedule. As the study continues, the final vaccine efficacy percentage may change. They have not reported any serious safety concerns and recommends that the study continue to collect additional safety and efficacy data as planned. The data will be discussed with regulatory authorities worldwide. Just to sort of drive home, what they're talking about, vaccine efficacy is a very simple term. So vaccine efficacy is defined as the attack rate of unvaccinated people, which is simply the fraction of people in the placebo arm that became infected. And the attack rate of vaccinated people is the same thing for vaccinated people. So the vaccine is, if it's efficacious, ARV is going to be less than ARU. So for example, if ARV is 0, right? So nobody's infected in the vaccinated arm. So this is the perfectly protective vaccine. Then this is 0, and ARU divided by itself is 1. So it's 100%. Right? If there's no difference between them, the efficacy is 0%. Here are some numbers for you. And since they said it was greater than 90%, they don't tell you what the split was, but you can calculate it. I'll make some assumptions that there's exactly equal number of participants in the vaccinated, unvaccinated group, which might not be exactly the same, but it's close enough. So you had 94 total cases. If you had 2 in the vaccine arm versus 92 in the control arm, that would be an efficacy of 97.8. If you had 5 versus 89, it's 94.4. 7 versus 87, 92.1, and 8 over 86 is 90.7. So, obviously they say it's greater than 90%, which means that was probably this. So a couple of things that you might ask, based on this, is one, you might be a little surprised that, you can draw conclusions based on such small numbers. And that this is statistically significant, right? Remember what you're measuring here. This is not an accurate point estimate. So if you put confidence intervals on it, they'd be quite wide. But what you're trying to say is there's a baseline efficacy that they put in the protocol. They say 50%, and you need to collect enough data. Right? I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it will be stipulated in the protocol as a desired endpoint. And you can calculate with statistical significance, based on say 164 cases with very, very high power, that you've achieved or failed to achieve that efficacy. The other thing you immediately see from this is this vaccine is not perfect. So you get, and that this is pretty representative, that, it decreases your risk by a factor of 10, but it doesn't eliminate it, right? Still. So just whenever you see, the reason, I spent some time discussing it is because you get very little information from a press release because all you get is this number, right? Greater than 90%. But what does it actually mean? And this is more or less all I could find about what it means. As a little bit of another backstory about this particular vaccine, they have a publication from phase 1. So this is a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, Safety and Immunogenicity of 2RNA-based COVID-19 vaccines. You can go and look up the original paper if you want, but here's basically one of the things that you might have also seen in the news, is that there were some anecdotes about people saying, oh, this vaccine gives quite significant subjective side effects. So if you've ever received, if you're one of those individuals that has a reaction to an influenza vaccine, you might know what that means. You get sort of local pain, inflammation. Sometimes you can get fever. So here's what they've measured for these for side effects. If you look at paddle A here, you have things. So they're comparing two vaccine candidates. They're all that's different between them is which molecule they put in them. So B1 is a receptor binding domain, and B2 is the entire spike. And you have a percent of participants, and you report mild versus moderate versus severe, right? So mild is green, blue is moderate, and gray is severe. So pretty much more than half reported some pain at the injection site. It increased with the amount of dose. So 30%, 30 micrograms is the highest. Basically 100% feel something. For higher doses, you have some redness, reported some swelling. This is first dose, right? So this is what you get at day 1. And then in day 21, you get a booster, and you still have pain, redness, and some more swelling. And they also measure things like systemic events. So did you have, say, fever, right? Fatigue, and chills, right? And you can see that, especially as you increase the dose, you have pretty uniform reports of, fairly substantial subjective events from this vaccine. I mean, none of them would be considered severe, but it's, it's basically like a flu vaccine. The question is, how reliable is anecdotal evidence? Are the patients who provide the anecdotes usually anonymous? How do you know the anecdotal evidence is valid? They're all good questions. So, the report that I saw, it was not from the trial participant. It was, or maybe it was, but it was a specific person. She, it was a woman. Her photograph was published, but an anecdote is just that, right? It's a personal story, but it's something that we're very strongly relate to. Because at the end of the day, it'll be you receiving a vaccine. So you primarily care about how it's going to affect you as opposed to what it's going to do to the population as a whole. And then the other thing that they've measured is vaccine potency, right? And if you might remember, when we looked at, various measures of correlates of protection, what you want is so these vaccines are designed to stimulate antibody responses. um, immunoglobulin G. You measure the potency of this response by reciprocal dilution. So, the less antibody you need to neutralize 50% of the virus, which is what's plotted on the y-axis, the better the response is. So this is a logarithmic scale. This is a 10-fold dilution. This is a 100-fold dilution. This is a 1,000-fold dilution. The numbers are given here. And let's just focus on BNT162b2 because that's the one that was in the news. So you have time series. So at time 1, before the vaccination, there's no response. So you're sitting in the baseline. Then, this is dose 1. At dose 2, you have 21. And there's, this dotted line is, presumably a categorical reference for what you need to call this an effective response. So the higher this bar is, means the more potent the antibody is. So you can sort of see a couple of things from this. One is that you really do need this booster and you need to wait 7 days. So they measure the efficacy at day 28. So day 1 and between the 2 shots, there's some protection, but not very much. It really sort of comes up a week after the second shot. And then they haven't really folded it out. So we don't know if it's going to stay like this for a year or it might decay in a couple of months. But, immediately it's protective at day 28. And you see, some benefit from giving a 20 milligram dose, but not a whole lot more benefit from giving a 30 milligram dose. And this is stratified by sort of the traditional adult group, 18 to 55, versus the older adult group. And as you might expect, generally because we know that in old people, immune responses are modulated, sort of attenuated compared to what you would see in younger people. You see the same pattern, with the possible exception that at day 21 here, right, whereas the normal adult group, 18 to 55 shows some response, there's no response in the advanced age group, but they do develop responses at a lower level than the 18 to 55 age group, but still above what is considered protective. Here, and this is an important reference point, just to sort of tell you, whether or not it's clinically relevant. They've measured the corresponding titers from human convalescent sera, so people that had COVID-19 and recovered from it naturally. So this gives you kind of a baseline of what you would expect with the most effective vaccination of all, which is an actual infection. So it's quite good. It compares favorably. So 2 other important things to give you a context of what we can expect from this particular vaccine is, so, one, this hasn't been approved, but it will be approved based on the information that we have at the moment. And they're saying it's going to be approved by the end of the year. Or at least that's the information that seems to be circulating. I don't see any reason to doubt it. So the question is, if we have this vaccine and it is effective and it has no side effects that are concerning, which are all very desirable outcomes, but they're still big ifs. Scaling up an unknown technology always is fraught with potential dangers, regardless of how many precautions are taken. But based on the current, and this is again a quote from Pfizer release, based on current projections, we expect to produce globally up to 50 million vaccine doses in 2020 and up to 1.3 billion doses in 2021. Right, so, there's already a little bit of ambiguity there. I mean, do they count a dose as, a round of 2 treatments, or do they say, each, because you need 2 shots. Does it mean that they're going to have 50 million, they'll be able to vaccinate 50 million people or 25 million people? It's a little ambiguous. There's no data yet because they plan to submit data from the full phase 3 trial for scientific peer review publication. And then if you dig a little deeper, and I didn't have, a scientific reference for this, so I just, copied and pasted something from a news source, is this and another potential vaccine user technology that requires especially cold storage. So unless you have a deep freezer that is going to minus 70 degrees Celsius, the shelf life of this vaccine is about 5 days. You need to have a deep freezer in order for it to be effective for 6 months. So there's already an immediate logistical hurdle to wide-scale delivery and deployment of a vaccine that requires extremely cold storage, simply because you don't have that much capacity installed, even in the United States, let alone if you look at under-resourced countries. I don't want to be a pessimist here. I'm just sort of putting all the pieces together that I think provide a comprehensive picture. So this is a great news, right? Just to remind you, when we discussed vaccines, remember there was the typical timeline from development to approval is at 10 years. So it looks like in 2020, we'll be able to do it in 1 year, which is truly remarkable. Of course, we had a bit of a head start because mRNA technology was developed, in anticipation of things like this. There was a lot of prior research based on SARS-1. So we didn't start at zero, but still, we should stop and sort of think very positively about the fact that we are where we are at the moment. So this is a very good result, but it also doesn't mean that this solves all the problems, because you need to worry about things like production and logistics. Now, not to be outdone, because the United States announced a 90% vaccine efficacy, the Russian government had to report something that was greater than 90%, so 92%, right? It was also released. So this is a different vaccine. This was a vaccine that was certified first in August. There was a lot of debate whether or not it was done, with appropriate caution or not. But there's a lot of politics involved around this. I'm not going to try to judge, what's good and what's not. It is important to emphasize that this vaccine has a very different delivery mechanism. It's a more traditional recombinant vector vaccine, where an adenovirus is used to deliver the spike antigen. It also has 2 injections. They use different vectors for these injections, AD5 and AD8. But they say a well-studied human adenoviral vector platform that has proven safe and effective with no long-term side effects in more than 250 clinical trials globally. This is actually an important selling point for this particular vaccine. That and the fact that you don't have deep storage, right? Is you have more data on just the general safety of this delivery mechanism. mRNA vaccines have never been used in wide-scale clinical applications. So we simply do not know what to anticipate. I mean, we can do all the due diligence that we can imagine, but until you actually deploy it on the wide population and study it, you don't have, hard gold standard data. So this is based on even fewer cases. So this was based on 20 cases, and if they report 92%, I'm not entirely sure how they get 92%, because that means that you had, out of 20 cases, you had 1 case in the vaccine arm and 19 cases in the control arm, and that gives you 94.7. So maybe they were just not equal size. That's the only thing I can guess, but that was based on a very, very small number of infections. So that's where we are as far as the vaccine announcements go. So it's all exciting, but there's still a lot of work to be left. Now, I'll give you 2 more sort of interesting anecdotal stories before I move to the main topic of the week. One, there was this, a colleague of mine sent me this paper just today, and then I thought it was kind of an interesting side story. Just to remind you, get back to the genomic part of this course, which we, sort of drifted in and out of. This is a case report that also appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, sort of a unique patient case. So this is a case where an individual that was immunocompromised became infected with SARS-CoV-2. And because he was immunocompromised, and because it wasn't treatment that interfered with the normal function of his immune system, in his particular case, he never cleared the infection. So you had infection occurring sometime in the spring. It was originally diagnosed, put in treatment, then sent home. But then what you see is that he kept coming back to the hospital. They would do PCR, I find the virus, give him more treatment, send him home, and eventually, things progress to the point where he experienced respiratory failure and died, 6 months later. But you have this sort of interesting case. The reason I want to highlight it is this kind of shows you what would have happened if SARS-CoV-2 were a chronic disease. So more like, what happens with HIV, what you would see, this persistent within host evolution, right? So this is a tree, this is a phylogenetic tree of viral strains, from the US, Massachusetts, because that's where this patient was seen, the rest of US, Asia, and other countries. And this clade, the subtree here shown in brown, are the sequences that were obtained from that one individual, right? So this is time 0, this is time 1, and you can see the corresponding chart time 2 and time 3. So you can see that this virus basically continues accumulating mutations as it evolves in this specific individual. And the level of mutation accumulation is actually pretty significant. So, if you take, so here, look at these viruses, for example, you have an Asian virus, which is this kind of dirty green color, and you have a US virus, which is a pink color, and you can kind of see how far apart they are. Maybe a couple of changes across the genome. This virus within one host managed to generate more diversity than what we see in a worldwide circulating population. So this just highlights what we're dealing with is an RNA virus. And if you don't, if you basically can let it replicate in a host, it's going to continue evolving. And they've done some sequencing to identify where evolution takes place. So this is a genome, and this is sort of an indication of where they observed, different types of mutations. And they specifically call out the fact that there was a lot of apparent change within the spike protein, including the receptor binding domain. They don't really describe what this means in terms of adaptation. What this virus does is just that it evolved within the host. So the reason I mentioned this right after the vaccines is because, the most likely outcome, based on the information that we have, is that a single vaccine is not going to be the end of all, right? Because it's not going to be 100% effective, and the virus will continue at a population level accumulating some mutations that will eventually make the vaccine less effective. So you'll need to change the vaccine, to chase the virus. The virus will change to escape the vaccine. It's not a done deal, but that's sort of one distinct possibility when it becomes, especially since you've read the seasonal part of the seasonal paper, this is a possibility that you'll sort of have to keep updating the vaccines, in which case the mRNA vaccine has an advantage over other vaccines because it's much easier to change, right? All you have to do is just, adjust the payload, which is easier to do than in vector-based vaccines. And then, switching topics, again, this is another paper from New England Journal of Medicine, and this is going back a few months, because I believe this outbreak happened in April. Let me take questions first. So with the seasonal flu, does the vaccine contain multiple antibodies for multiple different possible mutations, since one host can have so many different variants? The seasonal flu, it's a very good question. So you have multivalent influenza vaccines. So they do have several antigens, but not very many. They usually have 3 or 4. So they try to target influenza A, a couple of strains, and influenza B. So it's basically like getting a package of 3 or 4 vaccines at once. But they don't actually target different variants. An influenza vaccine has to be predicted. So what you have to do is you have to look at the sequences and the circulation patterns at the beginning of the year to try to predict what's going to happen at the end of the year. And sometimes we do a good job, sometimes we don't do a good job. And if we guess wrong, then the vaccine is not terribly effective. A combo vaccine, it is a combo vaccine, but there is no such thing. Imagine, you have tens of millions of viruses circulating, which means that they'll have tens of millions of slightly different strains. You cannot physically design a vaccine that's going to sort of chase every single possible mutation. So you have 2 options. You have the option to try to find a vaccine that targets as many of those variants as possible by looking at structure or conserved epitopes. And this is pretty much the design here. Or you assume that the virus is simply not going to be able to change that much. So for COVID-19, at the moment, the virus is pretty homogeneous. So this a single vaccine strain is going to be effective against a large fraction of what's circulating. But there's, yeah, you could make a vaccine that targets only conserved regions, but that's actually very, very difficult to do because the virus hides conserved regions, for example, right? So they're not accessible to the antibodies. Remember, the virus has an evolutionary imperative to not be easily killed. So it hides things that are conserved using all kinds of evolutionary tricks. But that's sort of the goal. Yes, you're trying to look at conserved regions, but sometimes they're available, sometimes they're not. Anyway, so different influenza vaccines. No, there's some regionally different vaccines. They all make similar predictions. I mean, there's a recommended. There's an international panel that makes this recommendation. The World Health Organization typically runs it, and then pretty much all the manufacturers follow their recommendations. They're slightly, they may package more if your antigens. They might have different delivery mechanisms, nasal versus intramuscular, but they pretty much all follow similar predictions for the strands. Oh, the MINC mutation. Yeah, we'll talk about the MINC mutation next time. There's a lot of confusion about the MINC mutation in Denmark, I think. But this is sort of a very interesting case study, an outbreak of COVID-19 on an aircraft carrier. So if you go back to the news, and I didn't do it, but you can, the big Navy nuclear aircraft carrier, Theodore Roosevelt, had an outbreak where they had to, come to port, and then there was a lot of noise and debate about it. I believe the captain of the vessel resigned in protest because, he felt like the Department of Defense wasn't taking, good care of his crew. But from the standpoint of epidemiology, it provides a unique case study. Unique in the sense that, one, you have an isolated community in close proximity with one another, because, I mean, if you've ever seen what an aircraft carrier is like, the living quarters are very, very tightly packed, especially for not for officers. So there's plenty of opportunity for close contact and spread. Social distancing in an aircraft carrier is impossible. You have on the other hand, you have a very healthy population. So they're typically young, healthy men and women in good physical shape, typically without a whole lot of complicated conditions. So this shows you, a couple of things. One, what happens to the transmission of the virus in such close quarters, and what does it do in terms of population? So, a crew of nearly 5,000 people. So they followed clinical and demographic data for all crew members, including results of testing by RT-PCR. All crew members were followed up for a minimum of 10 weeks, regardless of test results or the absence of symptoms. Here's the epidemiological curve of what happened. So they had a port visit at the beginning of March. They had, following this, personnel, supplies, and mail are delivered to an aircraft carrier during carrier and board delivery. So the idea here is that you have an opportunity for introduction, both due to the port visit and, exchange of people and materiel. They had individual cases that looked like symptomatic cases of COVID-19. And then, but that was done using retrospective analysis. Sorry. The first case was identified at the end of March, and then it basically followed a traditional epidemiological curve where you had, an outbreak, a lull, an outbreak, and then eventually the disease, runs its course. So on the plus side, there were very few serious symptoms. You can see by category, what people reported. So, most cases you had some headaches, cough, congestion, altered taste or smell, sore throat, body ache. So all of these are basically, flu-like symptoms, chest pain and chest pressure, maybe except with the altered taste to smell, going down to more progressively severe symptoms. So the crew was predominantly young, general good health. Over the course of the break, 26.6% of the crew tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, and more than 1,000 infections were identified within 5 weeks after the first lab confirmed infection. Additional 60 crew members had suspected COVID-19 without the test. 3/4 of those with infection had no symptoms at the time that they tested positive. And nearly half of them had no symptoms whatsoever during the clinical course of the disease. 23 were hospitalized, 4 received intensive care, and 1 died. I try to find some more information on the person that died. All the paper says is that, they died of cardiovascular complications. They don't say there are any pre-existing conditions. It was, what was the age and other factors, but 1 person did die. And crew members who worked in confined spaces appeared more likely to become infected. And the conclusion is that you basically, once you have this disease, and again, there's nothing new. We saw the same thing, with much deadlier consequences than a nursing home. So you have tight quarters coupled with asymptomatic transmission. Once the virus gets going, by the time you realize it's there, it's pretty much too late to do anything. Nearly half, but on the plus side, in this case, nearly half of those who tested positive for the virus had never had symptoms. So it's both a plus and a minus. Plus, obviously, because you don't want to have, this means that for a lot of people, this virus doesn't have any significant consequences health-wise. But from the prevention and treatment, this means that if you were, for example, to you really try to do something like, test, trace and isolate, you cannot count on people to, report their own symptoms, because people may very well have, 2-week-long infection during which they're able to infect others, but they have no symptoms and they have no idea that they are infectious. All right, now for the main portion of the course, I'm just going to go through the paper that you guys already read, because I think it sort of summarizes a lot of the information in one paper. It's a preprint, with all the attendant caveats. But I tend to find myself, quite strongly in agreement with the author, because that's my personal opinion. It doesn't mean you have to follow that at all in your paper. In fact, encourage you, I would really hope to see a diverse set of submissions. So just, write your conscience. Don't expect, don't try to guess what I want you to write, because I don't want you to write anything specific. Just whatever you write, try to justify it. So it's a preprint by a gentleman named Ari Jaffe. I hope I don't mispronounce his name. I also just assume, based on the name, that it's a he. I could be wrong. It's a physician with experience in public health, Department of Pediatrics. So before I go through this paper, I just wanted to throw some other sources of information which you might go. Is that there's a lot of, and it's a little hard to find. There's not a whole lot of peer-reviewed publication, but if, for example, this figure is from the Dallas Fed, so Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, so the United States government, which shows you one way to measure the economic impact of basically COVID caseload. So this doesn't have anything, this doesn't show you anything in terms of intervention, but it shows you that there is a, this dependence between sort of the severity of how many cases of COVID you have per 100,000 individuals, and the expected year-over-year change in GDP. Right, so you have a couple of outliers here: Vietnam, China, Taiwan, Korea, which both, were quite. All these countries were quite effective at, stopping the spread of the disease based on the information that we have. And they also didn't suffer significant economic consequences. You can see there's a large cloud of pretty much everywhere else, so the United States is somewhere in this pile. I don't remember where it is. Maybe I saw it in the other. Yeah, no, there's the United States right here. Sort of a bit of an outlier in the sense that, we have a lot of a large caseload, but relatively, smaller than based on this trend line decrease in GDP. And then you have, Belgium, Sweden, France, Mexico, Great Britain. But based on this chart, you can see that there is a clear dependence. The more COVID cases you have as a measure of the severity of the epidemic, the worse the economic outcome is. And you can look at other factors, which is lockdown stringency and economic activity, which is now a direct impact of interventions on economic activity, where you have lockdown stringency index in Q1, which is measured in some arbitrary scale, with 0 being no lockdown, which is Sweden, or very close to it, to China and Hong Kong being the other extreme as sort of the most dramatic case of lockdown. You can see that Italy had pretty strong interventions in Korea, Taiwan, France, and then the United States is sort of here in this cloud. Again, there's a dependence of the stronger, the more stringent the lockdown was, the stronger impact it had on economic growth. And if you try to, one of the things that impairs economic activity is mobility. So you had change in the level of mobility. Here you would have a reverse relationship where, the strictest lockdown here in Italy had the strongest restriction on the level of mobility. And again, Sweden, USA, and Australia here, at least early on, had no restrictions. And in that sense, you had, low, drop in GDP. And here's an indication of the stringency over time, which shows you that, this is a paper that was cut off in May. So, China had very, very stringent early lockdown and kind of remained stringent. You had a lot of the countries that started basically minor changes and then had a big ramp up and sort of slow decay. As far as, we all remember, hopefully, what happened. Information was scarce in March. There was a lot of really, doom and gloom information flying around. Some of it justified, some of it not. But in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, historically, most countries in the world implemented lockdowns. I personally really do not like the term lockdown because all I can think of is a prison, right? Where you have, lock down the prison because the inmates are unruly. So this is just, this word, if you're talking about, communicating and getting people to accept something, just a term like this is very, very unpalatable. You could come up with something more approachable. But, what it really means, it doesn't mean, literally restrict people to not move, but it just some sort of a gradient between restricting population movements, work, education, gathering, and general activities. And we've kind of, now, what is it, more than half a year into this epidemic, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the original stated goal was not to prevent the transmission of COVID-19. It was not, viewed as a sort of a major tool in our arsenal. The original stated goal was almost uniformly to flatten the curve of COVID-19 cases, to buy time, prevent immediate deaths, and avoid overwhelming healthcare capacity. And you can go back and look at any of the major news publications. They had some nice charts about peaks versus flattening curves. The whole goal was not to have too many people requiring ICUs or ventilators at once, but try to spread it out over time. Question is, in lockdown, do you mean mandated lockdowns where there are penalties enacted by the law in violation, or just highlight recommended lockdowns? It's a good question. You can define lockdown whichever way you want. It's just lockdown is being used by authorities without really specifying what it is. It really means all of those things, right? So you can have mandated lockdowns where there's penalties, like in Australia and New Zealand, or just, suggested lockdowns. I'm not entirely sure what happened in the United States. There wasn't a whole lot of enforcement, but from what I recall, and my personal view is that at least initially people were very, very eager to, go along with it, because I think, in the beginning, there was a lot of, fear and just desire to get over this and, do the right thing. So the arguments against, and that this particular author was also in favor of the early lockdowns, but the whole goal is that, you can see now this week, the word lockdown has entered, U.S. policy vernacular again, because some of the, one of the members of Biden's COVID task force, gave an interview and said, yeah, I mean, we could do another 4 to 6 week lockdown, get things under control, get us to the point where vaccine is widely available. The UK has implemented lockdowns, the European Union, various countries have implemented various stringencies of lockdown. So this is not a one-off. It's, it continues to be a, sort of a policy tool that's continually used. From my personal perspective, as a parent of school-old children, school closures are a manifestation of some sort of lockdown, because even though my children are not physically required to sit at home, they're not able to go to school. So the question is, why do I personally disagree with lockdowns? It seems like strict lockdowns significantly decrease deaths in other countries, not in the US, where lockdown was more of a suggestion. Well, let's sort of, let's fall through this preprint, because I think the author makes, the arguments better than I could. So the arguments against is, why did we decide to implement a lockdown in the first place? Was the decision appropriate at the time? Could we have done something else, and why did we do what we did? The second is, even if the original lockdowns were justified, and potentially subsequent lockdowns are justified, is there new information that emerged to undercut some of the reasons to have lockdowns? Thirdly, and this was not considered at all in any degree of depth in the beginning, and you still don't see it discussed, much at the moment, is you have to consider significant collateral damage of lockdowns. And finally, for any policy recommendation, in order to, in some cases, there's only one way to go, right? An asteroid is headed to Earth. If the asteroid hits, we're all dead. So we need to do something to blow up the asteroid. That's one solution. There's no alternative. In this case, there are alternatives, and people have done different things. Countries have done different things. So we have to be able to compare them. And one of the ways to do this is to perform a cost-benefit analysis. And you can define this very precisely and very carefully to make the point, of how do you compare things? Because without comparing alternatives, your policy making basically becomes guesswork. So the author of this manuscript puts together a fairly compelling selection of quotes from initial modeling papers that predicted very, very severe consequences of not implementing dramatic restrictive measures. And these are all early papers, and I think I'll read a couple of quotes. Prolonged intermittent social distancing may be necessary into 2022. Intermittent lockdowns are occurring for a total of 75% of the time, even after July 2022. So, this paper basically says you have lockdowns for 2 years, give or take. The Imperial College paper, this is probably the most famous from this one, that used modeling to predict, 500,000 deaths in Great Britain and 2.2 million deaths in the United States, but mid-April, so a month, surpassing ICU demand by 30-fold if lockdowns did not occur. So very, very dramatic. This was, this specific study was cited repeatedly by the U.S. Federal officials as a recommendation for its reaction, for lockdowns. We estimate the absence of infections, COVID-19 would have resulted in 7 billion infections and 40 million deaths globally this year. Lockdowns could have saved 38.7 million lives. Suppression will need to be maintained in some matter until vaccines or effective treatments become available. So, I think I make my point that a lot of these papers, a lot of these early studies sound at a very, very strong alarm, that a dramatic action had to be taken. Now, you must realize by now, and we've discussed this multiple times, that these are all based on projections, on models. I'm a PhD mathematician by training, in my previous life. So I've developed, models, and I'm all for models, and I can explain, the ones that I'm sufficiently familiar with what they do and what they don't do. But the model is only so good as the data that you put in the model and the parameters you put in the model. And one of the things that you realize very quickly is that any model of a complex system is a very, very poor approximation of reality. So the question is, how good were those models? And what we know by now is that these models were not very good. One of the, there's a lot, there are a lot of retrospective and postmortems about why, what different models said. I'm just going to give you a couple. So there's a live, this is an interesting website that I encourage you to look at, COVID19projections.com. So this guy, and it's one guy, he's biased a little bit because, he develops a projection model and he sort of runs this ongoing comparison with other models. So the goal, for example, here is to say best performing models for US state by state. So the goal is you take data from some time, say here, for example, you want to predict what would happen on October 3rd, right? And you want to predict this, further or closer to the time of October 3rd. So say you may be able, this is the hardest problem. You want to predict it from 6 weeks out. You want to predict it from 5 weeks out. You want to predict it from 4 weeks out, 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out, and 1 week out. So all the models should do better the closer the prediction range is, because it should be easier to predict what happens next week than it is what happens 6 weeks from now. The numbers in these charts indicate an absolute error, right? So the smaller, it doesn't really matter what it is, the smaller the number is, the better it predicted actual data. The color basically indicates, do these models predict the dumbest model possible, which is you simply take the average of the previous week and project it forward. You say, my prediction for what happens next week is exactly what happened this week. This is the null model. And the models that are shown in red do worse than the stupid model, right? So there's a class of models, including Google Cloud AI, which fails to outperform the dumb model. So these are not very good models, at least, based on that metric. The reason I say that the guy is biased is because, YYG is the model that he, develops. And the COVID Hub Ensemble is a model that integrates the results of all the models. So the top line is the best. But all I want you to take from this is, say you're a policymaker, right? And you want to, you need to make a decision based on models. You have this large array of models that are all predicting the same thing. And they're all predicting, things in the future based on the current data. How do you choose one, especially if they tell you different things? And there could be quite dramatic differences. I mean, we're talking about a 10-fold difference in error. This model could be telling you ICUs are overwhelmed, do something immediately. These models are telling you nothing unusual is going to happen. You'll be fine. So how do you decide? It is not an enviable situation. There are lots, and how you decide eventually is by doing these types of comparisons. So you sort of, evaluate models over time. You compare their predictions to what actually occurred, and then you adjust the models as necessary, and you reject the ones that are not doing well, and you promote the ones that are doing better than others. Here's another paper that looked in more detail on simply, trying to predict daily deaths and ICU bed utilizations in New York State. So this was used, these models were actually used for policy decisions in New York. And there are a couple of issues that this is a pretty involved paper. It's quite well written. overall, but I'll just sort of highlight a couple of points. Is one, the model is only as good as the data that you use to train the model on. And what's shown in this graph are time series of the death counts over time. And these are all different measurements of the same quantity. So depending on where you took your data from, if you did it from New York Times, USA Facts, Johns Hopkins, or COVID tracking, you would get different inputs to the model. And this is important to realize that this is the input to your model. You take this as the ground truth. So this is meant to measure the actual count of deaths. There's a question of why is this huge peak? And that's because at some point they basically backdated all the, they lumped all the dates, all the deaths up to this point into that daily measurement. So this is just a reporting change. But if your models start with different ground truths, if you can't accurately measure something that should be fairly reportable, which is the number of deaths per day, that is already a problem. And you can see if you take a different source of data and without realizing that something like attribution changes, might influence what you measure. This is the basic data before we even started any of the model fitting. And then here's a different, way to look at it, where you're trying to predict. These are, 4 different models being compared. Again, doesn't really matter what they are, just 4 different models. And what you want to measure is how well they're doing at predicting the number of daily deaths. Now, when a model gives a prediction, it will give you a number and it'll give you a confidence range. It's going to say, I predict that 3 weeks from now, you're going to have 1,000 deaths with a confidence range between 500 and 1,500, say. So a good model is going to get its estimate within, the actual estimate of 1,000 is going to be pretty close to the truth. If that doesn't happen, the second model should say, oh, well, if it fell between 500 and 1,500, that's still some sort of success. It was within the confidence interval. If the actual number is outside the confidence interval, the model completely failed. It gave you a completely wrong prediction. Not just the actual prediction, but the error bars were also not wide enough. So the model is useless. It has no intersection with reality. So what's being measured here is this 4x4 plot, where what you're doing is you're, depending on which data set you train the model on, you will have different predictions because you have different data sets. And what you're trying to measure is how often, do these models fall within the 95% confidence interval. So how often do they make predictions that are within the error bars? And you can see quite, depending on which model you use, some of them are pretty bad. Like this blue model, if you try to predict, 15 days or 15 steps out, only 50% of the time it actually falls within the error bar. So this model is no good. And some of them, and worst of all, they make systematic errors. So this model always over predicts the number of deaths. So it's a pessimistic model. It always says, the prediction is going to be the actual, either predict or over predict or under predict. And here's another chart where they basically, I'm just going to tell you what this means is that early on, these models were very poor at predicting the actual ICU bed capacity. So they were all very pessimistic. The question is, which curve is the actual death count? There is no, that's a good question. I don't know. It's the actual data themselves are noisy, depending on how you measure things. So you could aggregate them, you could average these numbers, you can get some sort of an estimate overall. But on this chart, there's no actual data, just whether or not the model hit its target. Is your opinion, is it better for a model to overpredict or underpredict? I mean, it really depends on the context, right? It's always the question. Think about it this way: what's the cost of making a mistake? And it's very different in different cases. One of my favorite example is that if the action that you will take is dramatic and irreversible, for example, if because of a misdiagnosis, the doctors take out your kidney, and you didn't have to do it because of a false positive, that's a very, very serious error. You want to avoid this. Whereas if the danger is you just take, you're incorrectly diagnosed and you have to take some pills that don't really have any side effects, well, you waste the pills. You don't really need them, but there's no significant effect. In this case, what you really want is an accurate prediction. In this case, both models that underpredict is really bad because you don't take significant sufficient interventions and people die. Overpredict is also bad because you take such severe interventions that the cost that you pay is out of proportion to what you had to pay. I mean, the goal is to target it pretty close to what you need to do. So to quote directly from the question, was it a source of the CDC data? The CDC collect their own data. That's a part of their mandate. But Johns Hopkins, they sort of aggregate all sources of data. So if you want to go for one overall worldwide record tracking, that's probably the source. I want to say the paper of record, but it's not the paper of record. It's just the database of record. So a key takeaway from our analysis is the serious thought and investment has been made in quality data collection when it comes to COVID-19 daily death data, as well as COVID-19 resource utilization. Clinical trial methodology for data quality control must be brought to bear, especially when the consequences of policy decisions can so dramatically impact the lives of millions of people. However, putting the issue of data quality aside, our analysis shows that models tended to have very poor performance, both in terms of accuracy, as well as in terms of capturing uncertainty. So the original decisions, therefore, were based on models that simply said failed. I mean, there's no other way to put it. The early models made predictions that were not realistic. Perhaps I should moderate this a little bit because an argument can be made is that we don't know the counterfactual, right? The interventions were made. Without the interventions, it could have been so that 2.5 million people died. But if you look at fine-grained predictions, say in terms of ICU utilizations, including real-life data, right, with the actual interventions, these models were also poor. So these models attempted to account for changes in the dynamic, and their short and long-term predictions were not good. So the other paper that I thought was a classic example of correlation does not equal causation is that less than a month ago, a preprint came up with the title of Decrease in Hospitalizations for COVID-19 After Mask Mandates in 1,083 US counties. Here was the chart, where the argument was made is that percent point difference in hospitalization proportion due to COVID-19. If you standardize based on mask usage and correct for population mobility, testing rates, confirmed cases per 1,000 age categories, it looks like you have a nice association, or the introduction of masks, seems to decrease the rate of hospitalization. These are the counties that were used. Unfortunately, this is what happened. The authors have withdrawn this manuscript because there are increased rates of SARS-CoV-2 cases in the areas that were originally analyzed in the study, which means that if you follow this further out, the curve takes back up. So this is the danger of sort of doing life science, because your predictions that look really good here, if you just take this curve a little bit out, it goes back up. So the premise of the study is now completely wrong, or at least it's not as easy as what could have been made. And this is the danger of trying to describe very complex systems with simple one-dimensional approaches. So the other thing which you have to keep in mind is that COVID-19 and the medical aspect is only one thing. I mean, the most complex system here is the society, and the way people react and groups of people react to dangers, stimuli, and everything else is very difficult to model. And the first thing that does a paper control for enforcement? Is there a more accurate way of determining mask compliance with that? No, this paper, this is all they controlled for: population mobility, testing rates, confirmed case scoring. So no, they don't have enough data. But that's a really great point, Peter, because if you don't include the right confounders, you might miss an important association. There could very well be an effect. It just needs to be measured differently. But yeah, that's the mask efficacy is going to be it's going to remain debated for a long time. My personal view is that if you do a risk benefit analysis, the cost of wearing a mask is so low that even if it has no benefit, there's no downside to wearing it. At least at the moment. But there's more than enough circumstantial evidence that at least in some settings is quite protective. If you really want to pin it down, you want to run a case control clinical trial. And as far as as far as I know, there hasn't been one that was published. It was supposed to be one done in Europe, but I don't think it's been published. But I mean, I digress. Mask mandates are here, right? Just a fact of life. But going back to the way people make decisions, a lot of it has to do with not necessarily information based. A lot of it is emotional and sort of driven by what other people are doing. And I don't have to convince you, because I'm sure you remember this, is that especially at the beginning, both social and popular media, they really amplified the negative. So there was a lot of panic aspect to this. The way reporting was done, there was a lot of focus on sensational numbers, just case numbers, deaths, anecdotes, people on gurneys in New York, scenes of chaos in northern Italy, which led to what can be viewed as a one-sided focus on preventing infection. So to quote from this paper, a war effort analogy is apt, with the unquestioning presumption that the cause is right, that the fight will be won, that naysayers and non-combatants, for example, those not wearing a mask, are basically traitors, and there are technical solutions such as vaccines and drugs that will quickly overcome any apparent problem or collateral damage. And a disregard and disinterest on the part of individuals in the enormity of the collateral damage, either to their own kids, people in other countries, or their own futures. So the thing that there was a PNAS paper that this preprint cites, which I didn't link to, but it's there, which basically tried to do an analysis of what was the strongest predictor of whether or not a country would adopt a non-pharmaceutical intervention. In other words, some form of a lockdown. So it spread to 80% of these Office of Economic Development countries within a 2-week period in March 2020. And the interesting finding of this paper that the only statistically significant predictor of a country implementing NPI was not the number of cases or deaths. It was not the population of people at risk. It was not the number of hospital beds per capita in the country, but it was the number of earlier adopters in the same region. So basically, somebody started it and everybody else followed. There was an unquestioned assumption that there were and are no alternatives to extreme measures implemented in entire populations with little considerations of cost and consequences. Question, do you think part of the reason there was so much sensationalization in the popular media was also in part due to the political climate with the election this year? I don't think it was that way back in March. I think in March there was a lot of real concern because some of the early data were quite troubling. And there was just lack of information. I mean, it's fog of war. You have to make a decision based on the information that you have. And there was also a lot of times you make decisions without the historical context. And I sort of tried to bring this in to this course over and over again, because you get a feeling that, one, COVID-19 is sort of a unique challenge to the human race that our generation is experiencing. It is definitely a very troublesome event that has caused a lot of damage. But, if you look at human history, a lot of similar events took place. And there were other infectious diseases that spread in a similar way. So a lot of historical context was basically, not considered. So for example, in October of 2019, the WHO published that for any future influenza pandemic, travel-related measures are unlikely to be successful, are likely to have prohibitive economic consequences. Measures not recommended in any circumstances would be contact tracing, quarantine or exposed individuals, border closure. Social distancing measures can be highly disruptive, and the cost of these measures might be weighed against their potential impact. and border closures may be considered only by small island nations in severe pandemics, but must be weighed against potentially serious economic consequences. I mean, obviously, this is not exactly one-to-one, but an influenza pandemic prior to this was a reference. As a severe, likely outcome was always measured against something like, the 1957 or 1968, pandemics, maybe the swine origin. But things like this were not tried in other contexts. Were not recommended by world authorities previously. So one of the possible explanations, and I'm no psychologist, so this is just hand waving on my part, but this all plays to my preconceived biases, is that a lot of the decision making that we always make in this context and other is due to cognitive biases, which we may or may not realize exist. And even if we do realize they exist, they're difficult to control. So some of the ones that have been brought up here is the identifiable victim effect, which is where you ignore hidden statistical deaths reported at the population level because you see people, on hospital gardens in New York, and that's in front of you. This is, you see who's suffering from it. You don't see what might happen down the line, in terms of collateral damage. You just see this and you focus on this. Similar to this identifiable cause effect, so you prioritize efforts to save lives from a known cause, even if more lives would be saved through alternative responses. So do something immediately because it's going to do something. Present bias, which means that something that's in front of you, that prefer immediate benefits to even larger benefits in the future. And this is very general for decision making. It's just sort of discounting things that are likely to occur in the future. Availability bias, which means that if something is immediately in front of you, it's all over the press, that's something on your mind, this is the first thing that's going to come to the foreground. Anchoring bias, which is we stick with our initial hypothesis and disregard evidence that disproves our favorite theory. Superstitious bias, which means that some action is better than no action. And commitment bias, where once you've committed to a course of action, you'll continue it even in the face of evidence that are better options. So there's this philosophical dilemma or ethical dilemma that the paper poses, which is not unique at all to COVID-19. And I think it kind of illustrates the challenges in making these decisions quite well. So you have this, runaway train, and you have the option of throwing this switch. So, either let the, train go in one, fork, or, take this, reroute it in a different track. So if you do not divert the train, one person who will get run over. He's elderly and suffering from many diseases. You know him personally, and all his friends and family are watching you. They're all shouting at you to divert the train, claiming it is the moral and safe thing to do. You know that if you do not pull the lever, there's significant consequences to you. Your life and the society you live is over. If you pull the lever, the diverted train will load over 50 random people from all over the world as the train drives through them, including people in your own country. Yet those people and their friends won't know where the train came from that hit them. Right? And the consequences, just to map this onto coronavirus, if you do not divert the train, you're letting the virus range unchecked. So you have COVID deaths. If you pull the lever, the diverted train will pull whole countries into isolation, destroying many international industries and thus affecting the livelihoods of billions, which through reduced government services and general prosperity will cost tens of millions of lives. COVID reaction. Right? So you can see, the challenge in how do you make this decision? It is very, very difficult, even if you know for sure that the immediate cost is much smaller. And I'm not saying this is the case, we're just talking hypotheticals, that, even if you knew definitively that the right thing to do is to do nothing, it would be very, very, very difficult to do. You would have personal consequences as a decision maker, either through, losing your political office, suffering ostracism, criticism, being blamed for inaction. And, nobody wants to do the right thing, suffer from it and be judged by history, right? So these types of considerations have to be made if you think about how decision makers arrive at their decisions. You do not want to be the guy pulling that lever. It's easy for me to, sit here and pontificate about what I would or would not do. but you never know what you would actually do if you were in that position. So just, I'm personally thankful I did not have to make the decision. The decisions that I make have much, much smaller consequences. So in other words, a lot of the early decision making was, by necessity, made on incomplete, sometimes noisy information. Some of the model predictions were potentially incorrect, and a lot of the emotional, baggage, went into making these decisions. Now, once the next thing that you might consider is, whatever the initial response was, the subsequent response needs to make use of newly available information. So, this preprint. I don't get why in the article we read this week, in general, the models of lockdown effects seem to be trusted when we just saw how inaccurate models are. That is a very good point. And I completely grant it that it is a concern that economic models are just as fraught with error. However, my personal, and I'm not prepared to back it up right now, but sort of just in general principles, economic models are much older, right? So we've been sort of studying economics for a longer period of time, so you have a bigger training data set. They've generally, some of the models are verifiably good. I don't know if all of them are. But more importantly, regardless of whether or not the models are good, the fact that they're generally not considered in this discussion is troubling. So you're basically, you're a lot of the discussion that seems to take place is there's only basically one side is being considered, right? This focus to the exclusion of everything else on stopping COVID transmission. It is a laudable goal. If we could achieve it, it would be amazing, but the cost of achieving it is not zero. In order to make a significant, a reasonable decision, or at least to be able to discuss it on quantitative basis, you have to consider the other side of it. And people have been doing this. There's a lot of literature on it. This is just, the tip of the iceberg, but that consideration has to be made. You have to weigh pros and cons. You can't just say, we're not going to worry about the cost. Because there is a point at which the cost is so high that you have to start worrying about this. And you have to at least attempt to compute it. And how you do it is obviously very important, but not doing it at all, or at least not discussing it in a systematic way, is, in my view, unacceptable. So new information is the, and we discussed, again, all of this in more detail, and specifically, we talked last week about IFR, infection fatality rate. But initially, the virus was thought to be much more deadly than it turned out. That's a good thing, right? Initially, it was thought the infection fatality rate was greater than 1%, possibly several percent. Once, based on the current estimates, it is much less deadly overall. So the WHO recently estimated about 10% of the global population may have already been infected, which a rule of thumb gives you, 1.6 million deaths out of, 780 million infected, which is the infection fatality rate of 0.15%. So about 10 times less deadly than before, right? So not knowing anything else, and we discussed this again last time when we were talking about modeling, this is the key parameter, right? If you have an infection that is 50% infection fatality rate, this is an extinction event. You have to do everything possible, because otherwise, it doesn't matter what the cost is, because the cost of doing nothing is everybody dies. So it's irrelevant. And as you start ratcheting it down, the responses to diseases that have different severities has to be graduated. So we know that for a lot of diseases, we do absolutely nothing. We're just okay with, what happens. Common cold, for example, it has a non-zero fatality rate, just very, very low. Some diseases we would do anything to stop it. And where's the switch point? Is it 1%? Is it 0.5%? Is it 0.1%? The fact that there's potentially a tenfold difference between the initial estimates and the subsequent estimates might indicate that the response needs to be moderated or adjusted with this new information. We've also learned that you have highly disparate risk groups. So there's over 100-fold, 1,000-fold increased risk of death for an 80-year-old compared to children. And this is such an important predictor that it basically dwarfs everything else. So age is by far the most important predictor of risk compared to everything else that we've considered: obesity, diabetes, immune dysfunction. So this is like tens or hundreds of fold increase. Other factors have a 2-fold hazard ratio. My question: what would be the comparison when looking at the fatality rate of COVID in the elderly compared to influenza or other illnesses, specifically in the elderly, say over the age of 65, 70? I think there's a table later on that they compare influenza deaths in this age group, but if not, let me get back to you. It's not, for seasonal influenza, it's definitely not as high in 65 to 70-year-olds. For pandemic influenza, like if you're looking at Spanish flu, it was really bad for several age groups, including young adults. But yes, for COVID in the elderly is very, very severe compared to most other diseases. So a lot of the times, this is being focus on the elderly can be viewed as age discrimination. So what this preprint argues is that there's no discrimination in pointing out that the elderly are the group that requires the strongest protection from severe COVID-19 outcomes. And then in fact, and this is the reading that you're going to have for the last quiz, the FAIR priority model. I saw some questions early on about the fair and equitable distribution of vaccines. So the FAIR priority model is a science paper. I'm just going to show you the take-home message from it. So the distribution phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So we're at phase 0 now. We don't have an effective vaccine. But phase 1 is reducing premature deaths. The primary aim, reducing foreseeable premature deaths directly or indirectly caused by COVID. They have a metric, and the metric is standard expected years of life lost averted by administering the vaccine. The first author of this paper is Manuel Ezekiel. He's one of the people nominated to Biden's COVID task force. So this is a person that is likely going to have a significant effect on our policy. And this is what they're recommending, and I have absolutely no problems with that. It actually is the reasonable way to do it. In order to, you have to have some measure of prioritization if you have limited resources, and this is a reasonable measure. Priority to countries that would reduce most, standard expected years of life lost. Which, going back, what does it mean? Successfully treating a disease that kills children and young adults is, other things being equal, likely to lead to a greater prolongation and thus do more good than successfully treating a disease that kills people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And this is the basis of the FAIR priority model for global vaccine allocation, prioritizing preventing premature deaths using a standard expected years of life lost metric. And this is just to quote directly from the manuscript. So this seems fundamentally unfair, right? Because, you seem like, you would say that one life is more important than another. But the paper makes the following point. So, it's different from discrimination, such as racism. No one who is Black was ever white. In this case, everyone who is old was once young. In other words, there is an impartial, age-neutral perspective from which we can all see that it is in everyone's interest to save the lives of younger people. In a thought experiment, this author, they cite, Singer, asks us to imagine that you have just become a parent at some stage in your child life. She's likely to be infected with a dangerous virus, and her chances of being infected and dying from the infection are the same in any year of her life. Now imagine the curative drug A, effective if it's given to somebody under 40 years of age, and drug B, effective if it's greater than 40 years of age, are so costly that the government cannot afford both to be produced. Which drug should be produced? It is clearly contrary to her child's interests to vote for a drug B. This would increase her risk of dying before her 40th birthday. To improve her chances of living a longer life, we vote for drug A. Right. So this is sort of just a roundabout way to say that if you were, for example, as an adult, as a child, as a parent myself, if I were given a choice to prioritize the life of my child over my own life, then that's a complete no-brainer. And I think a lot of people generally have the same feeling that, you need to protect children first, and then you sort of, have a hierarchy of prioritization. assuming not everybody can be treated. The desired outcome, of course, is that everybody's treated, but you have to live under constraints of limited medical resources. So there's this argument that they make. It's actually an interesting study. So there's, if you're interested about it, completely unrelated to this. It's the veil of ignorance is a moral reasoning device designed to promote a partial decision-making by denying decision makers access to potentially biasing information about who will benefit most or least from the available options. So there's a whole paper discussing it in PNAS. So a fair distribution of resources is said to be one where people would choose out of self-interest without knowing whom among those affected they will be. What would I want if I didn't know who I was going to be, right? So this is actually a really great thought experiment. It's really difficult to do, right? It's basically you have to make a decision without knowing whether or not it's going to benefit you or people that you care about. It's sort of this average greater good, like, make a decision that would benefit the most people on average in some sense. In an experimental study, participants were asked to decide whether to give the last available ventilator in their hospital to the 65-year-old who arrived first and is already being prepped for the ventilator, or the 25-year-old who arrives moments later, assuming whoever is saved will live to age 80 years old. In the veil of ignorance condition, the participant was asked to imagine that you have a 50% chance of being the older patient and 50% being the younger. Asked if it is morally acceptable to give the last ventilator to the younger patient, 67%, so 2 out of 3, in the veil of ignorance condition versus only half in the control, meaning you know which one you are, answered yes. So this significantly higher fraction compared to younger age participants, older participants, and middle-aged participants were more likely to agree. Asked if you want the doctor to give the ventilator to the younger patient, 77% answered yes, maximizing the number of life years saved rather than the number of lives saved. So this is just an argument that people generally have an intrinsic sort of intuitive value system, right? Where, if you have to choose, you will make a decision that optimizes one thing or the other, but only if you have to choose. So the new information on the herd immunity threshold may be lower than pessimistic estimates. Again, we talked about this, and herd immunity has become a very fraught term, again, partly because it's poorly named. Herd immunity, raises all kinds of undesirable annotations, like the lack of, choice and free will. At the moment, there's no compelling data to pin down herd immunity thresholds, but there are arguments being made that it could be much lower than 60 to 70%, which means that in many places, seroprevalence might not be too far from those levels. So here's just one paper that you can look at, and all it basically says is that if you have variation between how, if you just assume that some people are more susceptible than others to disease, and some people are more likely to transmit than others, you will have very different effects in herd immunity. So there's R naught, if you remember, was the key characteristic, which is the higher the R naught is, the higher the threshold of herd immunity is if everybody's equally likely to transmit and receive. So for example, if there's no variation, so everybody's equally identical, you need close to 100% immunity for very high R naughts, and these are so 80%, so on. But if you assume that a small fraction of people have an outsized effect at connectivity, so you have super spreaders, or some are more susceptible than others, depending on how variable this is, herd immunity levels could be dramatically lower. So it's conceivable to come up with situations which are not that outlandish, where you only need 20% of the population to be infected in order to have effective herd immunity. Obviously, knowing where we are in this curve has a very different, it's very important for making evaluating decisions, right? I mean, just as a very simple argument, we looked at seroprevalence in New York City last week. It's estimated to be around 20%, right? So that's an estimate that 20% people in New York City have already been infected with SARS-CoV-2. So you have 20% of the population that's immune. Depending where you are in this curve, you could have scenarios where this is basically enough on its own to maintain R naught, effective R naught or RE below 1. We don't have this information, but having this information or being able to estimate, what is the target
is absolutely essential for making policy decisions, because there's a very, very different calculus that comes into play if you need to immunize or protect 80% of the population versus 20% of the population. We don't know. And the fact that we don't know 7 months into the infection is disappointing. And the thing that I personally, this is probably the strongest selling point. For any strategy, you need to have an exit, right? Otherwise, you'll have endless wars, endless lockdowns, endless something. If there's no point at which you say this has succeeded or this has failed, if there's no outcome at which you say, we're going to go up to this point, and then we'll stop. If you look at what happened, so far, and I'll just give you an anecdote without going into specifics that affects me directly. So today, there was a meeting of the Lower Merion School District School Board where they were discussing whether or not schools should be closed because there's an uptick in Pennsylvania infections. So one of the things that's being considered is a 2-week remote school. Based on, I wasn't present at the meeting, but what I read about the meeting is that the parents simply don't believe that a 2-week lockdown or school closure is really 2 weeks. The history, at least based on what occurred here with school closures, is that there's no transparency from decision makers. They try to tell you that it's only for 2 weeks, but then it becomes 6 months. So the expectation now is that there is no exit strategy. Once you get into a school closure, it'll basically stay in it for as long, for no obvious, no obvious metrics. When do you say, we exit it? They could really well mean that it's 2 weeks, but unfortunately, there's no trust left in the community based on past information about or past performance, so to speak, to say that 2 weeks really will mean 2 weeks. That is a problem. And this kind of illustrates why when you propose very, very stringent and disruptive strategies, it is essential to have a clear exit strategy that people at least know, all right, this is something that we can put up with for, I understand why I'm doing this. I understand what the benefit is. I understand, what needs to occur in order for this to be released. So if no strategy exists, then lockdown is not really a strategy. The question is that kind of what happened with Temple? Yes, I mean, you guys experienced it more than us because, as faculty, we were told early on that for large classes, instruction will be remote, right? So we knew, I don't know, in the summer, at least that's what was going to be for large classes. But what happened with Temple could be argued as, perhaps lack of communication of exit strategy. And there are a lot of, Temple had this other constraints. For example, a lot of the decisions that Temple had to make were dictated by the health department of the city, because Temple is physically located in Philadelphia, and Temple cannot make its own rules. If Philadelphia public health officials say you have to close down, well, you have to close down. Neither of these two, so if the goal is to achieve herd immunity, and this is, again, herd immunity is what we're after. We need to, but it could be either through protection, which is what we're after at the moment. So you vaccinate enough people that transmission no longer occurs, or through a lack of action or inability to control the disease. It simply occurs naturally through waves of infection. Neither one of those is particularly attractive at the moment. So herd immunity through infection will take a long time to occur, causing economic and social devastation with or without lockdowns. It will take longer with lockdowns. It also assumes that immunity is long lasting, so that once you've achieved immunity, you don't have to continue shutting down to reboost immunity that disappears. And based on what we see, it's likely that more likely than not, that COVID-19 will become a seasonal epidemic. And there's a lot of talk about test, trace, and isolate with quarantine. It is feasible in places like New Zealand. It doesn't seem to be feasible in the United States, simply because of the sheer effort involved. Just the quote that I think I know a little bit about this in the context of HIV. I mean, we've worked a lot with epidemiologists to try to do contact tracing, molecular epidemiology in HIV, which is very, very difficult to do for other reasons. But one of the things that just kind of drives the point home, and that's part of the reason I brought up the aircraft carrier, is you really, really need to clamp down fast, right? So contact tracing and quarantine would have to occur very, very quickly, within basically the same day that somebody's diagnosed for more than 75% of the contacts. This is impossible to do with shoe leather epidemiology. You simply don't have enough time to interview people and go find their contacts. Which means that the only thing that you hear about now is something like mobile app technology that has its own feasibility and ethical problems. But it's the much more palatable outcome is herd immunity through vaccine, which is also not trivial to achieve. So you need to have an available vaccine, broadly available. It needs to be durable. And even if you have these two things, people actually have to take it. And a lot of it doesn't actually seem to be, there's a lot of resistance. So response to the 2009 pandemic of swine origin H1N1 influenza in the United States, the shocking numbers is only 1% of the population per week was vaccinated. The estimates say that about 30% of the population in North America and globally might just refuse taking vaccines. Today, I saw a headline in the New York Times that 2019 was a really bad year for measles deaths. Over 200,000 annual deaths worldwide, which is 50% higher than the previous 3 years. And the plausible explanation, it's due to people just not taking measles vaccine, which is 100% or close to 100% effective. And so far, we've basically only eradicated, one human disease, smallpox, with a fully effective vaccine that took 30 years to achieve. Question, are contact tracing, test trace isolation strategies more difficult, purely depend on population size or other factors involved in each country, assuming that policymaking isn't a factor? It's dependent on, it's dependent on a whole number of things, right? So, what test and trace really means historically is that you identify a case. Your goal is to basically stop transmission chains. So you identify a case that is COVID positive. Your desired goal is to track down everybody this person could have infected, test them, and do this sort of successively. So if one person, has 20 contacts, and each of those has 10 contacts, now you're 200 people, and then each of those have 10 contacts, now you're 2,000 people. You physically have to, find them, test them, and isolate them. You can do this for small numbers, and you can do this if you have time. But based on the speed of transmission, how often asymptomatic cases occur, the only feasible solution is to basically have regular testing and some sort of a global or national notification system that everybody that doesn't involve people, right? And that's I simply don't know how it could be implemented. There are other things. We've never done anything like that. I don't even know what analogy would be. There's nothing. We don't have. In Pennsylvania, you can't even issue a real ID driver's licenses because it's too difficult to put in chips or whatever it is necessary to be put into driver's licenses. So this is simply too big a lift, and it has to be done very quickly. So it's conceivable, but it's it's a much harder thing to do than to develop and distribute a vaccine. And it's never been successful before at that scale. And you can do test and trace in an isolated outbreaks. But once it's endemic, we're talking about about 5 million cases in the US. You basically have to track pretty much everyone. There will be a lot of implications and concerns regarding data privacy. Absolutely. and all kinds of constitutional concerns. It's just, I mean, you can't even get into that. I don't know, I can't even begin to discuss, all the complications there. Um, but before we even talk about this, just think about it. You have 30% of the population in North America and globally that simply don't want to take vaccines. That's an estimate, but I believe this estimate. Right. And what do you do about this? I mean, if you have a solution and people simply don't want to take it for a variety of reasons, I mean, how do you think that people will take to something completely untested and potentially with significant complications? All right. Now, sort of going through in terms of cost analysis. And I think this is sort of, I mean, this is the first place where I saw it all aggregated. I mean, you see sort of individual anecdotes, but if we start thinking about everything else that still happens in the world, and all the other ways people die, and all the downstream effects, and to start thinking about, we focused on this one disease, basically to exclusion of everything else. So what else is was going on? So here's the Sustainable Development Goals. Right, so UN has sustainable development goals in terms of nutrition, in terms of clean water, in terms of access to basic healthcare and education. So you have, now you have issues with childhood vaccinations in 70 countries: measles, diphtheria, cholera, and polio. There was a study done that if you had, from purely economic perspective, if you had, say, $1 billion to invest to improve the human condition worldwide, childhood vaccinations and access to healthcare are by far the best way to do it. So for each dollar, if I remember, I don't remember exactly what it is, but I think for each dollar invested in childhood vaccinations, you get maybe $30 back in terms of, it's hard to quantify, but in terms of, increased economic productivity, quality of life, it's by far the best way to invest your money. Now, this program is now stalled in 70 countries. So, we're going back on something that is known to be incredibly effective in terms of improving worldwide well-being. Education, 90% of students kept out of school. Early and primary grades are most vulnerable, with long-term effects on adulthood, which we don't know. We've never done this. We've never closed schools at that level. We've never tried remote education. We don't know what effect it's going to have on intelligence, drug use, employment rates and earnings, arrest rates, depression. Not just education. So you have, and I'm sure you've seen this in the United States, there's a stunning number of kids that rely on free school lunches for food security in the United States. When I heard this number, I was ashamed that it's so high. So it just things like this. If you can't go to school, you simply might not have enough food. If you live in an unstable household, you might have a loss of place of safety, less physical activity, lost social interactions. If you need special services or support for, you don't get this. Economic effects in families, sexual and reproductive health services, food security, undernourished estimates to increase by 100 million, disrupted food chain supplies, access to food, extreme poverty, we're going to reverse gains, estimated increase over 70 million. This is sort of one of the greatest success stories of the 20th century, the number of people that moved out of poverty into, more sustainable living. So this is very, very depressing to see. Infectious disease mortality from tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, all of these things, have to be accounted for. If you look at high income countries, delayed, avoided, disrupted medical care. So visit to emergency departments for infarction and stroke declined, right? I mean, do you think that means that we have less heart disease now? No, it doesn't. It just means that people don't get treated, don't get cold. Delayed cancer care, surgery backlog. The excess death in high income countries, 20 to 50% are not from COVID-19. There's an explained increase of death from dementia in England and Wales. I think this really, this hits women much harder than men for a variety of reasons. Women are being asked again to shoulder child rearing, all the additional family responsibilities. They're being asked to give up their careers. They're being asked to, sort of step this, just pick up the slack. But in addition to this, you have things like intimate partner violence, and things like increased female genital mutilation, child marriages, and you have what they call deaths of despair, additional suicides, mental health effects, surge in opioid deaths, alcoholism, drug use, suicidal thoughts. These are all significant effects with lives attached to them. And there's also the singular focus on just one disease kind of obscures the fact that we have other, most people that die in the United States are going to die from something other than COVID. Even if you assume that all deaths with COVID are from COVID, there's fewer than 10% of overall deaths are not from COVID-19. So we're not paying much attention to the remaining 90% of deaths. In Canada, it's 94%. Just to put things in context, in 2019, close to 60 million people died worldwide, which means that 160,000 people die every day. And this is, somebody mentioned it in the comments before that we're basically, this disease is also emphasizing the economic disparity. So there are far more deaths that occur in low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, especially at earlier ages. So here's this table for you to see, for example, that if you look at the under 5-year-old mortality, in the world, it's 38 per 1,000. And there's, COVID doesn't do anything to this, but all the other deaths are still there in sub-Saharan Africa, low-income countries. So we see that in order for COVID to become the major player, the major cause of death, and the most severe year that we're likely to have for COVID, you have to go into the age 65 or older. And even then, it only occurs in high-income countries. In low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, COVID accounts for a quarter of all the deaths in the advanced age group. And then again, to put things in context, selected causes of death in the world. So COVID-19 is 3,500 per day, predominantly affecting people over 60 to 65 to 70. Here's the other. So malaria, this is annual, right? So 1,000 a day, mostly affects children. Tuberculosis, 4,000 a day. Measles, 400 a day. Influenza, seasonal. HIV, 2,000 a day. Motor vehicle collisions, tobacco, childhood pneumonia, child diarrhea, and dietary risk factors, basically hunger. And you can see that this, hits kids. Some of these deaths are preventable if we take appropriate actions, so malaria, tuberculosis, and some we as society have decided we're willing to accept and trade off our freedom and well-being. So, for example, you could eliminate all motor vehicle collisions if you just don't drive. But, we're okay as a society with, having 1.3 million people die every year because of motor vehicle collisions. If you sort of, look at this, and again, it's mostly young kids, mostly in low to middle income countries. This is also a pretty staggering number if you think about it. This is per year, right? And, unless you look at it, you don't even think about it. It occurs, but, you don't consider it as a significant factor to change societal behavior. There is a good question. Has the lockdown changed this number at all? It has in the United States, as far as I know. There has been at least a transient drop in motor vehicle deaths. I do not know worldwide. I don't know if it moved the needle in Africa or in India. But there have been reports that just because people drive less, right, with nothing else, this is just reducing the opportunity for collisions. And finally, here we come to perhaps the most controversial and hard to handle the cost-benefit analysis, because you fundamentally do not want to put dollar signs on any aspect that relates to life or quality of life. But people do this all the time. I mean, you have to make these calculations in order to compare things, in order to make actuarial predictions, uh, you know, lost earnings and this kind of stuff. And it has to be a part of the policy decision making, the public health, it's just, you know, government policy decision making. An important factor is that people that have been driving sort of the discussion here are medical and public health experts, which are experts in medicine and public health, but they're not expert in cost-benefit analysis. It is a fact of life that health resources are finite and they somehow must be distributed. I mean, obviously, we would like to have everything for everyone, but that's not the state of the world. So we have to deal with the fact that health resources are finite. We also all take health risks to ensure a better future for ourselves, family, children, and society. This is fundamentally a personal choice within limits. Well-being of the population is the ultimate goal of government. You could argue with this, but you know, that doesn't seem too controversial. Depends on your political persuasions, I suppose. To compare outcomes of policies, one needs a common single metric of measurement to weigh trade-offs and make rational decisions. You know, so how do you, you know, and this is not in any way novel to COVID. These measurements have been done to estimate all kinds of you know, policies and effects on life. So the goal is to maximize the sum of years lived by the population, weighted by the health quality of those years. So quality adjusted life years. Or you can go a little deeper and say, you know, let's do well-being quality of those years. So well-bees. So qualities miss some important things like joy, status, and things that give fulfillment, like jobs. The well-being measures the value of anything that makes life enjoyable and captures almost everything that is important to people. It is subjective by definition, because happiness is subjective. It's measured by life satisfaction, asking overall, how satisfied are you with your life at this moment? It's based on this Likert scale, which if you ever taken an online survey, you know, on a scale from 0 to 5, you know, would you agree with this sentiment? You know, strongly agree, neutral, you know, disagree, and strongly disagree. So that's the kind of scale here. And one, it's a 1 to 10 scale. A 1 regular year of happy life is worth 6 well-bees. It has limitations, but to not consider cost-benefit analysis is tantamount to making no assessment and just to make policy in a vacuum. So you don't you don't consider alternatives. So there was this table that I found. Again, I wasn't able to find anything particularly authoritative on QALYs. But there's this one called Happier Lives Institute. I just put it in because it's kind of an amusing organizational name that tries to quantify, various effects on life satisfaction of events like, doubling your income, 1 extra year of education, losing your job, having a good job, finding a partner, losing a partner because of separation, losing a partner because of death, being a parent, having a physical illness, depression and anxiety, and commit 1 crime. It's kind of a peculiar way to think, about an event, and it has a more significant impact on the total life satisfaction of others. All right, so I've already seen this. This is very much the back of the envelope, and this is probably the weakest part of this particular preprint because it's just the back of the envelope, but all you're really trying to get is sort of ballpark numbers. It can quabble with the actual measurements, but I think this is a reasonable estimate to at least begin the discussion. So how do you estimate the benefits of a lockdown, right? So you basically want to measure how many lives, quality adjusted life years are gained because of, say, so assume the worst case scenario. The alternative is you do absolutely nothing. So you have 50% are infected to herd immunity, assuming that there's a 0.3% infection fatality rate multiplied by the entire population of people, multiplied by the average number of quality adjusted life years lost per death. This is based on the UK estimate. And this has to do with the fact that most people who die from COVID-19 are near the end of their natural lives anyway. So they, on average, have 3 to 5 healthy years left to live. So, if you do this math, you end up with 11.7 million deaths times 5, 58.5 million quality adjusted life years multiplied by 6, 360 million well-bees, which is a high estimate in the sense that this is an overestimate. It's unlikely that we have done anything. This many people would have died. And a more realistic number is probably 2 times lower, with fewer than 5.2 million deaths saved. It is important to note that this is not a comparison between deaths versus economy as prosperity. It's a comparison of deaths to deaths, because having economic downfalls and recession is translated to quality of life years lost. So it's lives versus life, as the economy is about lives. I quote again, this preprint is horrible either way. We're advocating for the least people to die as possible. So what are the costs? So you have to use models and approximations. And again, these numbers are just ballparks. So you can use historical evidence that there's a strong long-run relations between government spending or economic development and life expectancy. So if you want to put money on life, say how much is a quality of year, good life, good quality 1 year of life is worth. So $10,000 per year of GDP buys an additional 10 years of life. So the life of 75 years, $750,000 buys 10 years in life expectancy. So an average $75,000 per one quality year of life. In the US is an expensive country, right? We spend a lot of money in healthcare and other things. In other countries, you could have the same sort of purchase for much less money. So in India, for example, you could have about $25,000 per one quality adjusted life year. And it'll be very geographically dependent. Another way to look at it is based on research on how costly it is to save people from illness. So how much money do governments spend to maintain health? In the UK, it's about $20,000 per year. And in the US, what the market seems to bear is $80,000 per year, right? So this is a pretty accurate, estimate. Now, what are the costs of the lockdown in terms of dollars? Right, because now we have sort of a denominator, which is for each dollar of GDP lost, we can sort of measure, roughly speaking, what would this translate in terms of years of life lost? It is estimated that this year alone, the world economy will shrink by at least $8 to $9 trillion and will take a long time to recover. Now, this is sort of the noisiest projection. We talked about how crappy models are. Economic projections are just as crappy, in some sense, longer range as epidemiological projections, but it is definitely true that we lost a significant chunk of economic output. And even if you assume that all that happens is we basically just drop down and then start growing from this point at the same rate, it's estimated they'll take something in the order of 8 years to catch up. So this is, the difference between these curves is about $40 trillion less lost worldwide in terms of economic output. So if you do this, the cost benefit analysis of the world's response to COVID-19, so 360 million well-bees gained by preventing COVID-19 deaths, offset by 1.2 B well-bees due to recession, 280 million due to unemployment, 333 due to loneliness. Remember, this measures well-being. So if you're lonely and depressed, that counts against the total. Then they don't count disrupted health services, disrupted education, famine, social unrest, violence, and suicide. So based on this calculation, the balance is at least 5-fold greater for costs. And if you are sort of less optimistic, it could go up to 80 times. And there was a more detailed paper done by, it's actually a government document, it's linked here, Victorian, the province of Victoria, or is it state in Australia? I don't remember, but Victoria in Australia. This is an Australian document which was done specifically for the cost benefit analysis for Australia's response to COVID-19. And again, here the benefit is about 6 times less than the cost, right? And that's the cost per month. And the assumptions are listed here. So there have been a lot of, what are the alternatives? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Shreya. It is a state. All right. So there's a table there that just cites other, various letters which say we should be sort of more considerate in how we respond to this. So I'm not going to read any of this. It's in the paper. But the alternative approach is that you could consider is to basically have an adaptive strategy where protection should focus on high-risk groups and invest in improving the social determinants of health. Right. So, the interventions that you deploy should be done in a way to maximize its benefits. I mean, fundamentally, just locking everybody down, regardless of their individual risk, is likely to cause more harm long-term than benefit. And it is not true to sort of argue that no one is protected until everyone is protected. But I think perhaps my strongest criticism with one size fits all approach is that it obviously doesn't in this case, because there's so much data to indicate the different settings, different populations, different approaches will have very, very different and asymmetric responses. For example, hopefully the Open Safely study that we discussed last week from the UK, gives you scientific evidence that sending children to school does not seem to increase the risk of COVID complications in people that live with those children, including people over 65. So next time you hear this argument that don't send children to school, because they might infect their grandma and grandma will die of COVID, we have a piece of scientific evidence, a very well done large scale study in the UK that says that's not the case. So if somebody says that, they're not following the science, for example. As full disclosure, in case you haven't figured it out from our previous comments, I think that not sending elementary age children to schools is completely unjustified based on the evidence that we have. And the detriments are significant. So open schools for children, it is essential to provide them educational, social, and developmental benefits. Children have very low risk from COVID. Large studies show that living with children does not increase the risk of negative COVID outcomes. And the thing that I would like to stress the most is that children that suffer the most are the ones that have the fewest opportunities, the ones that are already underprivileged, and the ones that will have a very, very hard time catching up. It's the kids that live in challenging households, kids that don't have the economic, or parents that don't have the economic opportunity to sort of buffer these changes or provide them with adequate support. Children that need, special needs kids. I mean, the list can go on. There's so many stories. It's just heartbreaking. And the other thing is that instead of preventing transmission as the only goal, and we've seen papers that make this case before. For example, that science translation or science note from 2 physicians that said that we should really focus on better treatment. We should spend more time understanding how to treat COVID as a condition, and what happens, complications, livers, lungs, and so on. That we seem to be so focused on just one thing that we're letting golden opportunities go to waste. Better prevention, understand better, what happens once you've received a vaccine or infection. Is it enough to be protective? This area is actually getting some good, I think, focus. And how does COVID interact with other diseases like influenza? One of the positives of positive outcomes of these sort of severe interventions is that it seems like, based on the information that's coming in, we're going to have an unusually mild influenza season, simply because we've limited the opportunity influenza to spread. So, but there's also anecdotal evidence that if you're unfortunate enough to become infected with influenza and COVID, these diseases might interact in a way that enhances each other. And then quote, the concluding paragraph of this preprint was quite strong in my opinion. So destruction of lives and livelihoods in the name of survival will haunt us for decades. The decisions we made entail trade-offs that cannot be wished away. The most affected by the pandemic response are the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable, while we in high-income countries have shifted negative effects to places where they're less visible and presumably less serious. We must open up society to save many more lives than we can by attempting to avoid every case or even most cases of COVID-19. It's past time to take an effortful pause, calibrate our response to the true risk, make rational cost-benefit analyses of the trade-offs, and end the lockdown groupthink. So the last reading that I'm going to ask you guys to do is to read this ethical framework for global vaccine allocation, which I think is very important consideration, especially in light of the fact that a lot of the decisions that we made here in the US and in Europe are going to cascade and affect much less fortunate people a lot more significant than us. So think, of all the milestones of the UN that are being missed, and all the efforts, for example, tuberculosis and the malaria and HIV, that are falling behind. So, the sooner we're able to figure out how to deal with this in a holistic fashion, where everything is considered, on more or less equal basis. But that's a good read. It's sort of it kind of makes you think about the ethical factors that go into important decisions as to who gets limited resources first. Difficult to say, but would you say that outcomes could have been improved if we had spent drastically more money in research, biosafety, 3-level facility construction, et cetera? I seem to remember that one of the editorials you assigned criticized the US for not doing so. As a research scientist, I'm always for spending more money in research. I think it's not necessarily more money, it's how you spend the money. So a lot of the at this point, what was done, was done. There's nothing you can do to change it. I think the best we can do is to learn, from this period and not repeat the same mistakes. And it is not entirely obvious at the moment what it is that we need to do differently. I think some of this information will take years to learn and analyze. But I think, the strongest point, I guess, that I want to make is that there should probably be more, what I feel like is not happening is sort of a more open and robust discussion in the public sphere of various alternatives, because there are so many fraught issues there that when you talk about COVID and response to COVID, it becomes entangled with things like political preferences. And, if you say you're anti-lockdown, for instance, for whatever reason, you might be immediately accused, fairly or unfairly, that you're not, considering other complications. And it just basically becomes a fight instead of a discussion. And this degree of polarization over what is a disease that affects us all, and we should be working together to solve, is really unfortunate, I have to say. So the question is, what do you think of the recent studies of using dog to sniff out whether someone is positive? Reports say they're as accurate as current tests used today and can be done in 1 minute. I have not seen those studies. It would actually be, if you have a link, it would be fascinating to look at them briefly during next period. I have no opinion. It on its face, it sounds a little unbelievable, because dogs can't really smell viral particles, but it's entirely possible that they smell something else. But yeah, if you could share a link, if you have one, in Slack, it'd be really cool. Yeah, so in Finland, I believe they're using them in airports through sweat. Yeah, it's entirely possible that there's something else that the dogs smell, some other compound that is, uniquely one-to-one associated with COVID infections. All right, if there are no other questions, we'll call it a day. And then I'll see you all next week.